The RMS Empress of Ireland departed from Quebec City on the afternoon of May 28, 1914. It was scheduled for a routine transatlantic voyage to Liverpool, England. On board were 1,477 people, including passengers and crew. Most were Canadian citizens. Many were British immigrants returning home. Among the passengers were 170 members of the Salvation Army on a mission trip to England. The ship was operated by the Canadian Pacific Steamship Company. At the time, the Empress was considered a modern and reliable ocean liner. It had completed nearly 200 voyages across the Atlantic. Since entering service in 1906, departure proceeded without issue. Weather reports were favorable, and the St. Lawrence River appeared calm. The Empress left the port under the command of Captain Henry George Kendall, a respected officer with years of experience. There was no indication of any threat or unusual concern as the ship began its journey downstream through the river. The ship sailed steadily into the evening. Passengers settled into their cabins, some gathered in lounges or dining areas. Crew members carried out their standard duties. Nothing during the first hours of the voyage suggested any danger ahead. By the early hours of May 29, 1914, the Empress of Ireland was navigating the lower St. Lawrence. Visibility began to decline sharply due to an incoming fog bank. Captain Kendall ordered a reduction in speed and activated the ship's foghorn as a precaution. The crew maintained standard watch procedures at approximately 1:55 a.m. The lights of another vessel, the Norwegian collier SS Storstad, were spotted off the starboard side of the Empress. Both ships were on intersecting courses. The Empress was outbound toward the Atlantic, while the Storstad was inbound, heading upriver with a load of coal. Shortly after visual contact, a dense fog abruptly enveloped the area. Both ships lost sight of one another. In accordance with maritime rules, they reduced speed and used fog signals at regular intervals. Communication was limited to sound and visual estimates, as radio contact was not established. Captain Kendall altered the Empress's course slightly to port in an attempt to maintain a safe distance. He assumed the Storstad would pass starboard to starboard. However, the crew of the Storstad believed the Empress was turning to cross their bow. Misinterpretation of each other's positions led to a critical navigation error. When the fog began to lift, minutes later, the bow of the SS Storstad emerged from the mist at close range, less than 150 meters away. There was no time to make evasive maneuvers. The Storstad struck the Empress of Ireland on its starboard side, penetrating deep below the waterline. The moment the SS Storstad's bow penetrated the Empress of Ireland's starboard hull, it opened a gash approximately 15 feet wide and over 20 feet deep, located below the waterline. The point of impact was just forward of midship, striking between two major watertight compartments. Seawater began flooding the lower decks almost immediately. Within 30 seconds, 5 watertight compartments were compromised. The internal bulkheads were not designed to handle such rapid, high-pressure flooding. Several doors failed to close entirely due to warping and mechanical strain. The Empress was constructed with transverse bulkheads that were considered standard for the time. However, unlike newer vessels, the bulkheads did not extend high enough to prevent water from spilling over once multiple compartments had flooded. The ship's list to starboard grew rapidly, accelerating the spread of water into adjacent compartments. Efforts by engineering crews to activate pumps and isolate flooding proved ineffective. Water levels rose too quickly, overwhelming the ship's internal systems. The engine room began taking on water shortly after impact, forcing a shutdown of power and reducing the crew's ability to manage damage control. The ship developed a significant starboard list within minutes. As the angle increased, access to bulkhead controls and escape routes on the lower decks became impossible. The structural integrity of the ship deteriorated further as the hull pressure increased. By the time the situation could be fully assessed, the Empress was already beyond recovery. The rapid flooding and limited compartmentalization created a cascading failure that left no time for proper response. Immediately after the collision, the ship began to list heavily to starboard. Most passengers were asleep in their cabins. Many were thrown from their beds, or trapped as furniture and debris, shifted with the tilt of the vessel. The crew attempted to wake passengers and guide them to the main deck. However, The rapid angle of the list made movement inside the ship extremely difficult. Stairwells and hallways became steep and disoriented. In several lower-deck cabins, water was already entering through portholes or broken walls before passengers could reach escape routes. Above deck, the situation deteriorated quickly. Only a limited number of lifeboats were accessible due to the angle of the ship. The portside boats, now elevated high in the air, could not be lowered. On the starboard side, where lifeboats were closest to the water, many were either blocked, tangled, or launched only partially filled in the rush. The power outage following the flooding left most of the ship in darkness. Crew members shouted evacuation instructions, but panic quickly spread. Families were separated in the confusion. Many passengers tried to jump into the water rather than wait for boats that weren't reachable. Of the 1,477 people on board, only about 465 survived. Most casualties occurred within the first few minutes after the collision. Very few passengers from lower decks made it out. Children had the highest fatality rate. Efforts to organize a coordinated evacuation were impossible given the speed of the disaster, the physical angle of the ship, and the lack of time to deploy life-saving equipment. The RMS Empress of Ireland sank completely, just 14 minutes after the collision. It is one of the fastest large passenger ship sinkings in modern maritime history. Within the first 6 minutes, the vessel had already developed a severe starboard list. Water poured into the hull uncontrollably, increasing the angle with every passing second. At approximately the 8-minute mark, the ship rolled sharply onto its starboard side, submerging most of the lower deck openings and lifeboat davits. Several passengers and crew, who were still on board, were forced into the water as the deck tilted past recovery. The ship remained partially visible for only a few more minutes. At minute 13, the stern began to lift out of the water slightly, indicating the final stage of flooding. The bow had already been fully submerged. No significant structural breakup occurred during descent, but the vessel sank intact, descending nearly 130 feet to the riverbed. By the end of the 14th minute, the RMS Empress of Ireland had vanished beneath the surface. The majority of those who remained on board at that point were lost with the ship. Survivors in the water were left struggling and freezing. Temperatures with minimal flotation support. The rapid sinking left no time for rescue operations from nearby vessels. The SS Storstad, which had remained in the vicinity, was only able to recover a fraction of the survivors from the water. Despite the scale of the tragedy, the sinking of the RMS Empress of Ireland received limited global attention. Just 2 months after the disaster, World War I began. The headlines shifted. Political tension and armed conflict in Europe dominated the public's focus. There was no formal international inquiry. Canadian and Norwegian investigations were conducted, but media coverage was brief and localized. Without sustained public pressure, the findings led to no major reforms in maritime regulation. In contrast to the Titanic and Lusitania, the Empress of Ireland left behind no iconic photographs, no cinematic dramatizations, and no enduring cultural memory. Many of the victims were working-class Canadians and missionaries, lacking the media visibility of more affluent passengers. This further contributed to the event's gradual disappearance from public discourse. The sinking of the Empress of Ireland revealed critical weaknesses in ship, design and emergency response. But more importantly, it exposed how memory is shaped, not just by what happens, but by what the world chooses to remember.